The topic that has been assigned for me today is the challenges to theological education today. Before I start with that, I want to tell you that to me, the biggest challenge is not that. To me, the biggest challenge is to talk about that in 25 minutes. So I will leave the preliminaries and move right on. We are all aware of the many challenges of theological education today. Students who used to choose schools on the basis of denominational connections or theological convictions, now more and more choosing schools on the basis of geographic location, ease of access, financial issues. While online learning is here to stay, every seminary seems to think that online education is going to be their salvation, but all seminaries are going to fish in the same pool. And I do not need to talk about the financial issues. When you talk about the problems with theological education, immediately people talk about financial issues. Those are very serious. As you well know, very near here, the oldest freestanding seminary in the country sold its properties and moved to Yale Divinity School. A little bit further away, the seminary whose library was noted for being one of the great theological libraries in the world, a seminary whose library system was used throughout the world, classification system was used throughout the world, has found it necessary to put the library in the hands of a nearby university because they could no longer afford to keep it. And they had to sell a good part of the campus, and still that hasn't solved their financial difficulties. So obviously, those are serious issues. And I will return to those perhaps at the end, but I don't think that that's really the greatest challenge to theological education today. One way of putting it is the demographic challenge. I don't have to talk a whole lot about that. You know what that is. I'm glad to see that here we have so many different faces with so many different genetic pools that it's just fantastic. That's really the picture of more and more what's becoming the picture of this country. You mentioned about Latinos, but it's not just Latinos. There's also every other minority is growing at a very rapid pace, and the graduating classes are becoming very, very different from what they used to be. But even so, in most seminaries to this day, the graduating class is far from representing the population that lives around them. And yet, even that is not the greatest challenge. Because I think the greatest challenge is the demographic change in the church. I don't think there's a cause and effect relationship. But except for the Roman Catholic Church, every church that has traditionally required an MDiv degree for ordination is declining in membership. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean that seminary makes the church not grow. But somehow, the type of church that has traditionally required that kind of education is no longer the dominant church in the U.S. And that means that part of the challenge is how the seminary responds to that. And obviously, as you know, leading seminaries all across the nation are developing programs for particularly ethnic minorities. You're celebrating one here today, but you also have programs, for Vietnamese Americans, for Korean Americans, for Native Americans in different parts of the country, and that's necessary. To me, part of the problem is that so many seminaries are not heeding that situation, that condition, that they do not realize that they're becoming less and less relevant every year. I could mention some that are already in that situation, that are basically practically irrelevant. And yet, even though that's important, it is made worse because the churches that have traditionally been served by seminaries have traditionally required the MDiv degree are also the churches whose profile shows a greater age. So there's no hope to say, well, this is going to change with the next generation. No, the next generation is going to be smaller by just looking at the situation. Now, what do seminaries do about that? Another factor is that because of that in part, but for some other reasons, ATS-accredited seminaries no longer have the monopoly of theological education. When I was growing up, you talk about theological education, you meant seminaries. But that's no longer the case. Now you have a whole number of other organizations that developed that are there to train pastors, and those are the ones that are training the pastors for most of these minority churches. I could name all kinds of things. The ATH has a database of some 30,000 Latina pastors in the country, the churches in the country with their pastors, and quite a bit less than 10% of them are seminary graduates. Some years ago, there was a study in LA County that listed over 1,000 Latino Protestant churches. And that same year, in the whole western section of the US, in Protestant seminaries, there were something like 300 Latino students. So the monopoly is gone. Now there are these other programs. And now, what are we going to do about it? Obviously, the easy answer is the old answer, well, we are accredited and they're not. I remember being actually in Puerto Rico in a meeting like that when we were trying to bring together Bible institutes and seminary and so on, and the president of the one accredited seminary said, no, but we are the only one who's accredited. And that sort of put a damper on the conversation. Now, that might make you think good and superior and enlightened, but it's not solving the problem. Actually, what it's doing is postponing and ignoring it. Now, there are a number of alternative actions, and what do you do? Okay? When I look at especially denominational seminaries, but also any denomination that has traditionally been shaped, been formed by a clear confessional direction, I see that most of them are having difficulties in admission, in recruitment. Seminaries in my own denomination, which is United Methodist, that a few years ago used to have 500-600 students, Methodists, all of them, or most of them, now have about 200, 250, of whom more than half are non-Methodists. And most of those non-Methodists are people who do not require an MDiv, and they're studying them. Now, how does that happen? What is happening? Well, one of the things that's happening is that seminaries are developing 2-year master programs for people who are already in ministry. And that's very important, that's very good. What's part of the other thing that's happening is that you have all of these people who have been serving as ministers without any particular formal education, who now, for a series of reasons, begin deciding, I need to learn more, I need to study more. And they're eager for have that. So it's good to meet that need. On the other hand, it's also good for the seminary because they can do it on the cheap. In most cases, you don't have to have new courses for those people. What most seminaries that I know of are simply bring somebody who has been preaching for 20 years and being a pastor for 20 years and now wants to have a master's in pastoral ministry or some other such title, such program, And that person comes in, and they put them to learn New Testament together with somebody who's just coming out of college, and they might even put him to learn, usually he, that's why I say him, but he or she, put them to study homiletics with a group of pastors of young students who haven't seen a pulpit except from the outside, from that side. And there's something pedagogically challenging there. And I think right now, as I travel through the country, what I find is that most of these people who are in those seminaries are very grateful for what's being done for them, and they're very positive about it. But at some point, they're going to say, no, we require a different pedagogy. We require a different curriculum. We require different content. We require that somehow our issues, our experience are really taken into account in the way the courses are designed. And the seminaries are going to have to make a decision. And we really committed to this sufficiently that we will we'll be able to do that. But still, it's crucial because part of what's happening in the churches, in the seminaries or churches that are decreasing in attendance, in membership, part of what's happening is that, first of all, the seminaries of the same denomination are competing with one another. I know of a seminary that was having trouble with enrollment, and they hired some firm to come and study about how do we recruit. And the report was, this is the way that you compete with so and so and so and so and so and so. No, how do you have a different sense of mission? Which somehow doesn't hit me right. And then, if they still keep the same enrollment, what happens at the end is that they end up with greater numbers of graduates that they cannot place, which eventually, obviously, comes back to the issue of enrollment and brings it down. Now, so that the painless development of these two-year master's programs is going to become something that's going to require some very hard thinking, some very hard decisions about, are we really sufficiently committed to these programs that we are ready to move in such a way that not only our curriculum, the content of our courses, our faculty evaluations, how do you evaluate faculty? You know, in most of these seminaries, the faculties are not evaluated by how much they do in those programs for those pastors who are already working, but still in the old pattern of the same way that you evaluate professors in the university. And well, you know the story. I don't have to get into too much of that. Now, that takes you back to the financial challenge. Most seminaries, and by the way, I didn't study anything about you, so I can step on as many toes as I can. I have no idea what I'm doing, okay? Most seminaries depend both for their permanent long-term endowment funds and for their annual budget on a particular constituency that they have developed through the years. And they have developed that constituency, telling them, we are developing pastors for churches like yours. If it's a Presbyterian seminary, they go, the fundraiser goes to Presbyterian churches, goes to presbyteries and synods and so on, and talks to them about all the great pastors that we have raised for the Presbyterian church, and we need the new generation for the church, or the new generation and all that, and people write checks, and that's great. And the Methodists, which is my church, they do exactly the same thing. And it's not just denominational. I think even confessional seminaries do the same thing. We are evangelical. We are trying to make sure that the evangelical church keeps growing, and we want to make sure that the next generation has a church just like yours. Well, what happens when these changes I'm talking about take place? And a seminary that 20 years ago was almost 100% Methodist in the student body, and almost 100% MDiv students. Now is 40% Methodist and 60% Southern Baptist, or ex-Southern Baptist, most of them, Pentecostals of various kinds, independent pastors, whatever. Are we going to be able to go to those donors with the same pitch and the same spiel that we were until last generation, when what we are doing is not what we were doing in that last generation? What will happen when the fundraiser of a United Methodist Seminary shows up at an annual conference and says, we want to raise among you $500,000 for this and that, and we are going to spend half of the income from that in order to be able to have students who are not Methodist, students who become to churches that do not require seminary, students that from your perspective are the ones who are doing your competition to you. How long is that fundraising going to last? And to me, what that means is that the function of a fundraiser right now in this generation has to change. It has to be also an educational function, so that you don't just go and sell the seminary as it is, but you sell a different vision of the church, a different vision of theological education, a different vision of the mission of the school. Now, if you do that, and you get your traditional constituency to support that, then fundraising is going to be a success 10, 15 years from now. If you don't do that, in a few years from now, people are going to say, now, people out there are so different from what I thought pastors should be. They don't look like us. They don't talk like us. They don't think like us. They don't worship like us. Why should we support a seminary that's preparing pastors for those churches? And by that point, it'd be too late. Because if they are not trained, if those givers are not taught to change differently, to think about the mission of the church and the mission of the seminary in a wider way, when the time comes when that has to be done, it'll be too late. So that's the other issue. Now, the other issue that I just want to mention in passing, but I think is very important, is that we have to begin thinking of theological education no longer as what happens in seminary. Theological education is an essential part of the mission of the entire church for the entire body of Christ from beginning to end. It begins with catechetical education, it begins in Sunday school, it goes on to adult schools, it goes on to Bible institutes, it goes on to seminaries, it goes on to PhD programs, and none of those is better than the others. They're different. They're part of a total ecology of theological education. And just as in any ecology, when one of the elements in that ecology falters, there's problems for everybody else. The same thing is true in theological education. One of the things that, to me, is my passion is how do we relate the theological education that's taking place in Bible institutes, in church basements, in churches where the way that one learns to be a pastor is by mentoring. You go, you work with your pastor, and after a while, you learn how to do it, and you do it. That's theological education, too. It doesn't have all the ATS stuff, but it's theological education, too. And as a matter of fact, they have to teach us something. Now, so let me just finish with well, not quite finished. I still have about 2-3 more minutes. Let me just say something about my own experience, because when we began doing all these things that I've been doing about Latino theological education and so on, we used to talk about a pipeline. We're developing this pipeline that will get people and help them go to college and go to seminary, and some of them can go and get a PhD. It's a pipeline. And I think that's a wrong image. The image that I prefer to use is a drip hose. A pipeline is measured by how little it leaks and how much it delivers at the other end. And how little, by not leaking, how little relationship it has with the land that it goes through. An irrigation hose is designed to leak. Not all the water has to get to the end. And the water that gets to the end is no better than the water that's at the beginning. But that leakage means that this bit of land here is irrigated because some of the water leaked there. And then at this other place, some more is irrigated. And then at the end, you need people, you need water at the end. Otherwise, the stuff over there also dies. Yeah. But instead of evaluating our work on how many people get through, we also have to evaluate our work in terms of how much are we producing an irrigational leakage around us. And that's why the relationship between Bible institutes and seminaries is so crucial, so important. By the way, I don't know if you know, but one of the things, Pablo was the first executive director of the Association for Hispanic Theological Education, AETH, and then his father was the second, was Pablo's successor. But one of the things that the AETH has managed to do recently, they have signed an agreement with the Association of Theological Schools that if there's a Bible institute that AETH certifies as doing certain things, people who come out, who are graduates of those Bible institutes, can enter any ATS seminary as fully BA students. Not as a special student, not 50% route, nothing like that, but just as a regular student. Now, that's going to be a very slow process because we want to make sure that that this is not just a way of getting people. No, it's going to be a serious thing. But that is something that you all ought to be aware of, because how many Bible institutes are there in Boston? I don't think anybody knows. Let me begin by that. But even those who know a little know that there are quite a few. What will happen is somehow we consider that part of our job is not just to go to colleges and get people to come and so on, but that part of our job is somehow to strengthen some of those, to perhaps make a coalition, whatever, bring them to the point that they can become part of the same irrigation hose of which we are. Now, I just want to end by saying that when we talk about challenges, we're also talking about opportunities. And it seems to me that in the providence of God, every challenge is also connected to a promise. And we can look at these new demographics and say, oh, let's make the society what it used to be. Let's go back. Let's somehow erase all these differences that have emerged. And we can moan and feel bad and get angry and get depressed. Or we could say, perhaps what is happening is that in that providence of God, we have been given the unique gift of having the opportunity of taste a little bit of that vision of John at Patmos. And behold, I saw a great multitude of people that nobody could count, of every tribe and people and nation and language. And you don't have to go to Patmos to have that vision today. You can have it right here. And because Gordon-Conwell is part of that vision, I thank you for what you're doing, and may God bless you.